Welcome back, welcome back. Before the break, we heard the very different points of view from both sides in this conflict. But not at the same time, Hamas and the Israeli government still refuse to talk face to face. Although at some point, most people feel they'll surely have to. And what would they then say to one another? Well, joining me in the studio are not the official representatives of both sides, but experts who have a unique close-up view of what the negotiating positions might be. Azam Tamimi is an expert on Hamas. Danny Finkelstein is a journalist who knows the minds of the Israeli leadership. Gentlemen, welcome. One quick question about the Israeli leadership. We hear rumours of differences between, on the one hand, Mr. Barak, and on the other hand, Tzipi Livni.
Well, yes, if you have two Jews in a room, you'll have three opinions. I think if you were hearing rumours that there were no disagreements between a group of Jewish people, I'd be very surprised to hear it.
Well,
I'm sure there are big differences of opinion inside the Israeli government. It's one of the features of Israeli politics.
And the war is popular in Israel at the moment, isn't it? Will it stay that way?
Well, I hate to hear the phrase war described as popular. I think people ruefully regret the necessity to do this and hope that it will be successful in reducing suffering in the long term. But I think everyone can see that it's terrible to have such a conflict going on.
Absolutely. Azam, what's your reaction to the situation now?
Well, this entire war wasn't necessary at all had Israel agreed to the renewal of the truce, provided the siege was lifted. We would not have had all these people killed and massacred. I mean, there's a carnage in Gaza today.
So who are the people who still, in the Arab world, support Hamas?
Well, Syria supports Hamas, Libya supports Hamas, Qatar supports Hamas. That's if we're talking about the official level. South Sudan, maybe Yemen. But at the popular level, there's mass popular support for Hamas. Look at the rallies, look at the demonstrations, not only in the Arab world, but across the globe.
Do you think with a combination of the quiet attitude of Arab nations who one would have expected to support Hamas, allied with the fact of Israel's military actions against Hamas, do you think that Hamas will be wiped out?
Far from it. I was speaking to a Hamas leader last night, and he was telling me that Hamas infrastructure, that the infrastructure of the government of Hamas in Gaza has not been dented even. Out of more than 760 or 770 people killed in Gaza, less than 20 have been combatants belonging to Hamas. So Israel is killing the civilians, is causing so much pain to the population in Gaza, but it is far from even harming Hamas.
Danny, the theory among some of the Israeli supporters and so on has been that, in fact, they want to bomb the hell out of Gaza, make it clear to people that that's going to continue and that will turn people against the government, Hamas. Now, will it turn people against Hamas? Or will it not increase support for Hamas?
You know what, I don't think it will. I think it possibly will increase support for Hamas. That's why it's a terrible tragedy, because you can't kill your way to peace. But on the other hand, you can't, as a democratic government, sit there and allow people to lob weapons into your country and do nothing about it. And the problem is not doing anything about it doesn't work, and doing something about it doesn't work. Innocent people get killed in both those circumstances. So what we have to ask is, how do we get peace? And the only way that you can get peace is a two-state solution in which Israel is allowed to live in peace and the Palestinians get a homeland and a home state. Why do we think that all these Arab nations have turned against Hamas? The reason is because they can see that Hamas doesn't accept that single route to peace. Why do the Palestinian people support Hamas? I think it's because they do feel desperate. And they do feel let down by their leadership. I understand that, and I understand your anger and the tears that are being shed and the protests around the world, but I also just want peace. I want an end to the fighting.
You cannot have peace by cutting bodies of children into pieces. Look what Israel is doing in Gaza.
I realise that.
Well, Israel could have achieved peace by negotiating a long-term truce with Hamas. And since 1994, Hamas has been saying, withdraw to the borders of 1967, before the 1967 war, release our prisoners. There are 12,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli detention. Why is Israel keeping them there? Why is Israel causing so much pain and agony to the parents, to the fathers, to the wives, and to the children of these detainees?
I think we both know why those prisoners are in prison. But we also both know that those kind of things are negotiable. Look what happened in Ireland. And we can exchange and we can shout at each other and be really angry, but that doesn't get either of us anywhere. What we need to think about is what is negotiable, what can be agreed. And I believe there is a negotiation out there for a two-state solution. But unfortunately, and perhaps you're about to tell me this can change, Hamas does not appear to me to accept the idea that there can be the existence of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And I think that, I think that, no, I'm not actually. I think I'm trying to get to what I regard as the core point.
Yasser Arafat recognized Israel's right to exist. He agreed to the two-state solution. Mahmoud Abbas did. Where is the Palestinian state? Well, there is no Palestinian state because Israel continues to build settlements, continues to confiscate Palestinian land, continues to cause so much frustration and pain to the Palestinians. There can never be a two-state solution because of Israeli policy.
Hamas have not shown an interest in these conversations, negotiations that Danny's talking about.
Of course it wouldn't. And Hamas cannot. And I, as a Palestinian, can never recognize that the theft of my homeland was legitimate. That's why Hamas offered an alternative, which is a long-term truce. You cannot recognize that a crime is legitimate. The creation of Israel on our land and the dispossession of our people was a crime. But Israel is there. There is a reality. And that's what's called de facto recognition. So there is a de facto recognition, but there can never be a de jure recognition. The solution to this is to have a long-term truce. Hamas continues to say, withdraw to the 4th of June borders, 1967, release our prisoners, remove your settlers, and then we can have a ceasefire for up to 15 or 20 years' time. But Israel believes, Israel thinks wrongly that someone like Mahmoud Abbas is a better partner. They thought of Yasser Arafat like that before. That is never going to work.
No, nor, I would have thought, is the ideal of limiting things to 10 or 20 years. At some point, I mean, in Ireland, certain things were forgotten in order to get a settlement.
Of course. And I tell you the reason when that became possible. When the British government began to believe, through its security and intelligence sources, that Gerry Adams had decided to abandon the gun for the ballot box, then a deal was possible. And I believe the prisoners can be returned. I believe, hold on, sorry, I believe the prisoners can be returned. That is a very, very difficult thing to do because some of those people have killed Israeli citizens, and I'm sure you can say the same is true the other way. That's a very difficult thing to do. And I might say to you, that's not negotiable. How can that be accepted? And you reply, and we can never recognize Israel. All those things have to be done. In the end, we both have to do things that we sit here thinking on this sofa are unconscionable and impossible, because that's what peace means. But the very first step to that is to understand that peace cannot come at the end of a gun. I know that's true for the Israelis, but it's certainly true for Hamas, and I don't think Hamas understand or accept that yet. And that's why the other Arab states have turned against Hamas.
The very first step is to recognize the victimhood of the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been the victims all along. The Israelis, until today, do not recognize the crime that was committed against the Palestinians. And about Gerry Adams did exchange the gun for the ballot box, but he never abandoned the dream. The dream was never abandoned. And I, as a Palestinian, and Hamas as a group representing the majority of the Palestinians today, can never afford to abandon the dream of the right of return of the Palestinians to their villages, to their towns from which they were expelled when Israel was created.
I would have thought the right of return is an absolutely insoluble problem.
I think it's a very difficult problem. First, I should say, and we're about to get into a massive history dispute. I should say that
there's no dispute. Read the facts in history books. Israel came into existence in 1948. There was no Israel before. How come then in 1948 a new state is created? At the expense of who? The refugees living in Lebanon today, the refugees living in Syria today, in Jordan, in the refugee camps of the West Bank and Gaza. 1.5 million people live in Gaza today, the majority of whom happen to be from towns and villages that are today called Israel. There was a problem in 1948. That's history. You cannot deny that history.
All right?
Yeah, unless you have an irony removal, you can't shout at someone, there is no dispute. Obviously, there's a dispute.
Thank you both very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.
That was vigorous and enlightening. Thank you both. Thank you. In a war, it's always too easy to forget the real victims. Not the Israeli government or Hamas, it's the civilians who are really suffering. Who is representing their humanitarian interests? Well, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, is supposed to be coordinating the relief effort in Gaza. But yesterday, under fire from the Israelis, they stopped their aid distribution. So how can they work in such dangerous conditions? Joining me now is the UNRWA spokesman, Chris Gunness. Where does this difficult situation, dangerous situation after yesterday, stand now?
Well, let me explain what the suspension actually means. It essentially means that our convoys and our vehicles cannot travel around the Gaza Strip. And this is because they were coming under fire, direct and indirect, by the Israelis. One good example, or rather appalling example, I should say, at 1:15, that is during the pause yesterday, a 3-vehicle convoy, including a medical vehicle, was going into the town of Beit Hanun in northern Gaza to collect the body of a colleague of ours who had been killed. And this convoy came under fire, and it was hit 3 times. And I don't know anyone listening to this has ever been in an armoured vehicle that gets hit with a bullet, but, you know, it's alarming, and our colleagues could have been killed. So there were numerous instances of this sort during this conflict, and we were forced to this very, very regrettable decision. I can't think of any other humanitarian organisation which wouldn't be forced to make this terribly, terribly difficult decision, and it's with great regret. But we hope that the Israelis will give us credible assurances that the coordination mechanism which we had in place but clearly had broken down, when you've got clearly marked United Nations vehicles in pre-arranged routes, all the coordination done, being shot at, the mechanism is falling to pieces, and we have to get that mechanism up and running before we can get our vehicles back on the roads in Gaza.
And in this particular situation, what's next? I mean, the victims are the civilians, as we said, and the children. How does this compare with other terrible spots that you've been in?
Well, let me tell you, one thing makes the war in Gaza quite unique, and that is it's the only conflict I've ever been anywhere near that has a fence around it. And when you have a conflict with a fence around it, you have a situation where there is no safety. And in a situation where there is no safety, you have to have a ceasefire. And the Security Council expressed the voice of the world community last night. For nearly 2 weeks now, people have been, I think, appalled, heartily sickened by the pictures that they have seen of the suffering of innocent children and women and babies in Gaza. The Security Council spoke with one voice, and I'm sure in this programme you'll be exploring with the parties on the ground their approach to the ceasefire. But there are no excuses now. The international community has spoken through the microphone of the Security Council. It's showing itself to be credible and relevant at a time when all the world is clamouring for the guns to fall silent. So I hope that for the people of Gaza, this immediate ceasefire will come into effect. And as far as we're concerned, of course, it would make our lives a lot easier because we could get on with our work. Primary healthcare to 1 million people, food distributions on an ongoing basis to 750,000 people, cash assistance to 94,000 people. I think those figures speak for themselves. We have a huge task to do, and we at UNRWA are prepared to do it. We just want to be given a chance on the ground to do it.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris, for those words. We
Thank you.
Appreciate bringing us back to the human reality of it all. Thank you very much indeed, Chris.
Thank you.
And that's all from this special programme this week, this special half-hour programme. We'll be back next week with a more normal edition, hopefully with words like we were hearing there about peace and truces from Gaza. But we'll be back with a normal edition of Frost Over the World for 1 hour at the usual time next week. Until then, prayers for Gaza and goodbye for now.